The night the house fell silent was the same night the truth finally learned how to breathe, and once it did, it never stopped screaming. Because some families do not break loudly, they rot quietly until one soul decides to open the door that everyone else pretended was locked forever. Before we go any further, tell me something real for a second. Where are you watching this video from right now, and what time is it where you are? Because this story is about moments, and timing is everything. The estate stood on a cliff above the sea, all glass and steel and legacy, a monument built not just on wealth but on obedience. And inside it lived a family that believed silence was loyalty and questions were betrayal. A family led for decades by Victor Hale, a man whose voice never rose because it never needed to, whose approval felt like oxygen and whose disappointment felt like exile. And for most of his life, everyone around him learned to survive by becoming smaller, especially his children. The eldest, Adrian, learned early that love in this house was transactional, that affection arrived only when performance did, so he grew into a man who smiled perfectly and felt nothing. A man who believed control was safety and vulnerability was a flaw that deserved punishment. The middle child, Elena, learned something else entirely. She learned how to disappear in plain sight, how to listen without reacting, how to store memories like weapons and patience like fuel. Because when you grow up in a house where truth is inconvenient, observation becomes power. The youngest, Marcus, still believed in fairness once, still believed that families protected each other. But belief does not survive long in a place where reality is carefully edited, and by the time he was old enough to notice the cracks, the foundation had already been poisoned. Their mother, Margaret, was the soft voice in a sharp world, a woman who carried herself with grace and exhaustion, who hosted dinners with a smile while bruises bloomed beneath long sleeves, not always physical, often emotional, because Victor Hale never needed to strike to dominate. His favorite weapon was humiliation delivered privately, surgically, with a reminder that everything she had came from him and could be taken back just as easily. To the outside world, the Hale family represented perfection, philanthropic galas, scholarships, smiling magazine covers, but inside the house, fear was the air they breathed, and every hallway remembered footsteps that paused outside doors. Every room remembered arguments that ended with apologies spoken by the wrong person. The night everything changed began, like any other, with routine pretending to be stability, with Victor seated at the head of the table, Adrian discussing quarterly projections, Elena quietly observing, Marcus arriving late and apologizing too quickly, and Margaret serving dinner like a peace offering that no one had asked for, until Victor mentioned the trust, casually, almost kindly, announcing changes he had already made. Decisions that shifted ownership, stripped autonomy, and locked futures into structures only he controlled. And when Marcus questioned him, just once, not even aggressively, the room froze, because questioning Victor was a language no one spoke. Victor did not raise his voice, he did not insult Marcus, he simply smiled and said that if Marcus did not understand how things worked, maybe he did not deserve to benefit from them. And Margaret flinched, because she had heard that sentence before, years ago, when she had asked about a missing account, about money that vanished without explanation, about why her name slowly disappeared from documents she once co-owned. And that night, something in Elena shifted, because she saw the pattern complete itself, saw how control passed from one generation to the next, like a disease disguised as tradition. After dinner, when the house settled into its artificial calm, Elena walked the halls instead of sleeping, her bare feet silent on polished floors, her mind replaying fragments she had collected over years. A late-night phone call Victor ended abruptly when she entered a room. A locked drawer that was always moved slightly after cleaning days, a private meeting room in the office wing that no one else was allowed to enter, and a name that appeared and disappeared from conversations. Arthur Knox, a man introduced as a consultant but treated like a ghost, present everywhere and acknowledged nowhere. Elena did not act impulsively, she never had. She knew that truth revealed too quickly gets buried, so instead, she waited for opportunity. An opportunity arrived in the form of Margaret collapse 2 weeks later. A quiet medical emergency that doctors explained with clinical distance, stress-related, exhaustion, nothing dramatic, nothing legally suspicious. But Elena saw the relief in Victor's eyes, saw how his schedule barely changed, how meetings were prioritized over bedside visits, how flowers arrived in bulk instead of presents. And when Margaret died 3 days later, officially from complications, the house mourned publicly and reorganized privately, because death in the Hale family was not an ending, it was a restructuring event. Grief moved through the children differently. Adrian buried himself in work. Marcus spiraled into guilt, replaying every moment he had not defended his mother, every silence he had mistaken for peace. But Elena became still, terrifyingly still, because grief did not break her, it clarified her, and clarity is dangerous when paired with patience. The will reading happened fast, efficient, sterile, and shocking only to those who still believed fairness existed within legal language. Because Margaret left almost nothing. not because she had nothing, but because she had already lost it years ago, asset by asset, signature by signature, while trusting the man who promised to protect her interests. And Victor sat there composed, generous even, offering the children allowances, roles, futures that depended entirely on continued obedience. That was the moment Alina decided this story would not end the way Victor expected. But revenge is not loud at the beginning. Revenge begins as curiosity disguised as mourning. So she asked questions that sounded innocent, requested documents under the pretense of settling affairs, volunteered to organize archives, and slowly, quietly, she found the ledger. It was hidden in plain sight, not a physical book but a pattern. Transfers routed through shell foundations, properties registered under trusts that Margaret name once anchored and then vanished from, signatures that looked authentic but followed dates when she was hospitalized, sedated, or emotionally cornered, and at the center of it all was Arthur Knox. Not a consultant, but a legal architect, a man who specialized in extracting control while maintaining plausible deniability. Alina did not confront anyone, not Adrian, not Marcus, not even Victor, because confrontation warns the enemy. Instead, she built a timeline, mapping every shift, every lie, every moment her mother lost ground, and as the picture sharpened, she realized this was not just theft, it was erasure, a systematic removal of Margaret identity, autonomy, and voice, until death finished what paperwork had started. The house no longer felt like a home to Alina, it felt like a crime scene that had never been investigated. And she understood something vital. If she exposed the truth directly, Victor Power would crush it. But if she dismantled the system that protected him, the truth would surface on its own, and no one would be able to bury it again. That night, standing alone in the study, surrounded by books that spoke about legacy and ethics written by men who never practiced either, Alina looked at her reflection in the glass and made a promise that no one else heard, a promise not driven by rage, but by precision, because the most devastating revenge does not seek blood, it seeks collapse, and this family empire, built on silence, was already whispering its last secret. Alina understood that destruction required distance, so she did not move faster, she moved deeper, embedding herself into the machinery of the family business with a patience that unsettled even Adrian, who mistook her quiet focus for compliance, because in this family, silence had always meant surrender, and Victor rewarded it accordingly, inviting her into meetings she had never been allowed to attend before, praising her discretion, positioning her as a stabilizing presence after Margaret's death, unaware that every document Alina touched became a thread in a larger unraveling. The corporation spanned logistics, real estate, energy, and private equity, a web so complex that no single person fully understood it, which was exactly how Victor preferred it. But Alina noticed something subtle as she reviewed subsidiary reports, inconsistencies that were not mistakes but patterns, profits rerouted through temporary entities that dissolved within months, liabilities assigned to shells that technically belonged to charities, and advisory fees paid to firms that existed only on paper. And at the center of nearly every maneuver sat Arthur Knox, his signature appearing like a watermark on control. Alina began keeping two records, one official, clean and compliant, and another private, a living map of manipulation that grew heavier by the day. And as it did, her grief transformed into something colder, something sharper, because she realized her mother was not simply a victim of a cruel husband. She was collateral in a system designed to consume anyone who trusted it. Marcus noticed the change first, not in Alina's actions, but in her eyes, the softness gone, replaced by a focus that felt dangerous. And when he tried to talk to her late one night in the empty kitchen, she listened, but she did not explain, because truth given too early becomes a burden, and Marcus was not ready to carry what she had found. Adrian, meanwhile, thrived under Victor's approval, stepping further into power, repeating his father language, adopting his dismissive tone, unaware that obedience had turned him into a mirror rather than a successor. And Alina watched him with a strange mix of sadness and resolve, knowing that he too would fall, not because she hated him, but because he chose blindness when offered sight. Victor began planning a public rebranding of the empire, a foundation in Margaret's name, a grand gesture meant to rewrite narrative, to transform loss into legacy. And Alina recognized the opportunity immediately, because public virtue is the weakest shield for private corruption, so she volunteered to help structure it, insisting on transparency, audits, third-party oversight, all framed as honoring her mother values, and Victor agreed, confident in his ability to control outcomes, unaware that audits are not dangerous when you own the truth, but devastating when you have hidden it too well. Arthur Knox expressed concern during a private call, his voice cautious, suggesting limitations, delays, but Victor dismissed him, convinced that loyalty had already been purchased, and Alina smiled silently as she listened from the adjoining office, because the greatest flaw in powerful men is believing money buys silence forever. The first fracture appeared not as scandal but as confusion, an auditor requesting clarification on an old transaction. then another asking about a trust restructure, then a delay in a routine approval, and Victor responded with irritation, demanding explanations, assuming incompetence. But Alina saw the shift, the moment when questions stopped being isolated and started forming a chorus. Meanwhile, she reached out quietly to a journalist, not a sensationalist, but an investigative mind known for patience, feeding fragments, not accusations, letting curiosity do the work. And as the journalist dug, the past began resurfacing. Lawsuits settled quietly, partners forced out under pressure, charities dissolved after serving their purpose, and a pattern of legal aggression that crushed dissent without leaving fingerprints. Victor sensed something was wrong, but misidentified the threat, suspecting competitors, regulators, even his own advisors, tightening control, lashing out in private. And in one such moment, he confronted Alina, accusing her of mismanaging the foundation, of inviting unnecessary scrutiny. And Alina did something she had never done before. She met his gaze without flinching, and calmly explained that transparency was protection, that if he had nothing to hide, audits were allies. And for the first time in decades, Victor did not intimidate the room into silence, because confidence rooted in truth sounds different than confidence rooted in fear, and he felt it. The tension inside the house escalated. Adrian grew defensive, Marcus withdrew further, and Victor control began slipping in small but telling ways: missed calls, delayed responses, uncharacteristic errors. Because power is not lost all at once, it erodes, and Alina accelerated the erosion with precision, leaking documents at the right moments, ensuring regulators noticed discrepancies just as the foundation launched publicly, ensuring the story framed itself as a fall from grace rather than an isolated incident. When authorities initiated a formal inquiry, Victor responded with outrage, publicly decrying betrayal, privately hunting for the traitor, and Alina prepared for the most dangerous phase, because when empires sense collapse, they turn inward, devouring their own. Arthur Knox attempted to disappear, transferring assets, cutting ties, but Alina anticipated it, securing evidence that bound him legally to decisions he had orchestrated. And as pressure mounted, Knox panicked, offering cooperation in exchange for leniency, and suddenly, the man who had enabled Victor Empire became the key to dismantling it. The journalist published the first expose, careful, devastating, outlining systemic abuse of power without naming Alina, without dramatics, letting facts speak, and the public reaction was immediate. Investors fled, boards demanded answers, partners distanced themselves, and Victor Empire, once untouchable, became radioactive. Inside the house, the air turned poisonous, accusations flew, Victor raged, Adrian defended, Marcus watched in horror, and Alina remained calm, because she had already mourned the family she wished she had, and what remained was simply a structure, awaiting demolition. When Victor finally confronted her directly, demanding loyalty, invoking blood, legacy, sacrifice, Alina spoke the truth not as accusation but as inevitability, telling him that the system he built was collapsing because it was built on theft, because he erased their mother and expected the world to forget. And Victor, for the first time, looked small, not defeated yet, but exposed, because the worst thing that can happen to a tyrant is not punishment. It is recognition, the moment everyone sees him clearly. And as sirens echoed faintly in the distance, as lawyers scrambled and alliances dissolved, Alina understood that this was only the beginning, because revenge that ends too quickly teaches nothing, and she intended for this story to end with consequences that could not be undone. The investigation did not arrive with handcuffs or flashing lights at first. It arrived with letters, requests, schedules, interviews, the slow, suffocating weight of procedure that Victor could not intimidate or charm, because systems designed to appear neutral are the most dangerous enemies of men who rule through force of personality. And as regulators moved through the corporation with deliberate calm, Victor's rage turned inward, manifesting in paranoia, sleeplessness, and a desperate need to reassert dominance over the only place he still controlled, the family. He summoned Adrian daily, drilling him for loyalty, demanding reassurance, insisting that blood mattered more than optics, and Adrian complied, defending his father publicly, attacking critics, dismissing evidence as misinterpretation, because admitting the truth would require admitting his entire identity had been constructed on a lie. And that kind of collapse terrifies people more than prison ever could. Marcus, meanwhile, drifted further into isolation, haunted by memories of his mother and burdened by guilt he could no longer outrun. And one evening, after reading the second article published by the journalist, he confronted Alina, not with anger, but with quiet devastation, asking if their mother had known, if she had tried to escape, if any of this could have been stopped. And Alina, seeing that he was finally ready, showed him fragments of the truth, enough to ground him without breaking him, explaining how Margaret's resistance had been gradual, how every compromise had been framed as temporary, how love had been weaponized until compliance felt like survival. And Marcus cried not loudly but completely, because grief delayed does not diminish, it compounds. As the inquiry expanded, former employees stepped forward, emboldened by visibility, telling stories of intimidation, forced resignations, threats disguised as career advice, and patterns emerged that no legal team could dismiss as coincidence, and Victor, sensing the narrative slipping beyond his control, attempted to reshape it through spectacle, announcing voluntary restructuring, stepping down temporarily, appointing Adrian as interim leader, a move meant to signal continuity and stability. But Alina anticipated it, because power that changes hands within the same bloodline rarely changes behavior, and she had already prepared the next fracture. The trusts that held controlling interest in several subsidiaries contained clauses Victor had never expected to be activated, oversight mechanisms tied to ethical breaches, triggered by formal investigations, and when they engaged, authority fragmented. Boards regained power, votes shifted, and Adrian discovered that the title he accepted carried far less control than promised. Because Victor had always ruled by fear, not by process, and without fear, his system could not function. Tension between father and son escalated into open conflict, Victor accusing Adrian of weakness, Adrian accusing Victor of sabotage, and Elena watched their alliance crumble with grim clarity, because betrayal is inevitable in hierarchies built on dominance, and loyalty evaporates the moment survival is threatened. Arthur Knox's cooperation became public, his testimony outlining decades of calculated extraction, manipulation of legal frameworks, and deliberate isolation of Margaret from independent counsel. And with every word, Victor's image eroded further, transforming from patriarch to predator in the public imagination. The foundation bearing Margaret's name suspended operations pending review, a symbolic reversal that cut deeply. The narrative Victor crafted to immortalize himself now exposed his crimes instead, and Alina felt no satisfaction in it. Only a quiet alignment, a sense that reality was finally catching up. Inside the house, Victor's health declined rapidly, stress manifesting as chest pain, tremors, episodes of confusion, and for the first time, he depended on others, a dependency he resented and resisted, lashing out at staff, alienating allies, accelerating his isolation, while Alina maintained distance, refusing to become caretaker, because she understood that compassion offered to unrepentant power often becomes another tool of manipulation. Marcus moved out, unable to remain in a space saturated with unresolved harm, and his departure marked a shift Alina had anticipated, the breaking of the illusion that family proximity equaled unity, while Adrian remained, clinging to the house as if it could anchor his collapsing sense of purpose. The investigation reached its most volatile stage when criminal charges were formally considered, not guaranteed, but plausible, and Victor's lawyers scrambled to negotiate settlements, immunity, delays, anything to preserve the core of his freedom, and in a final attempt to regain control, Victor summoned Alina alone, offering a deal framed as reconciliation, admitting mistakes without admitting guilt, promising restitution, legacy reform, even partial confession, if she would help contain the damage, if she would testify to his character. And Alina listened carefully, because revenge that refuses to hear the enemy often misunderstands him, and when he finished, she declined without drama, explaining that accountability was not something she could negotiate, that truth did not belong to him anymore, and Victor, stripped of persuasion, resorted to threats, reminding her of her dependence, her past, her vulnerabilities, but his words landed hollow, because she had already dismantled every leverage point he once held. When he realized that fear no longer worked, Victor did something unexpected. He wept, not in remorse, but in self-pity, mourning the loss of power rather than the harm inflicted, and Elena understood then that closure would never come from him, it would come from consequence. The charges were filed weeks later, not the full extent of his crimes, but enough: fraud, coercion, obstruction, each count a crack in the myth of invincibility, and the arrest, when it came, was unceremonious, no spectacle, no public apology, just procedure. And as Victor was escorted out of the house that once symbolized his dominance, the silence felt different, not oppressive, but empty, as if the building itself exhaled. Adrian did not attend the arraignment, publicly citing health, privately unraveling, because his loyalty had cost him everything and earned him nothing, and in the aftermath, he turned on Alina, accusing her of betrayal, of destroying the family, of weaponizing grief, and Alina responded not with defense, but with truth, telling him that the family was destroyed long before she acted. That silence had been the real betrayal, and Adrian, confronted with the possibility that his success was built on suffering, retreated into denial, a prison more comfortable than reality. As proceedings moved forward, Alina shifted her focus from exposure to restoration, not of the empire, but of meaning, redirecting resources to genuinely independent initiatives, dissolving structures that enabled abuse, and ensuring that the story did not end with one man's fall, but with systemic change, because revenge that only punishes individuals leaves systems intact, ready to repeat the harm. And as the legal machinery turned steadily, grinding through years of deception, Alina prepared for the final phase, knowing that the deepest reckoning would not be public, but personal, because the most enduring consequences are not imposed by courts. They are lived, day after day, in the quiet spaces where denial once thrived. The trial transformed Victor from an untouchable figure into a case number, a shift so profound that even he seemed disoriented by it, sitting beneath fluorescent lights instead of chandeliers, addressed by title instead of reverence, and Alina attended selectively, not out of obsession, but to witness accountability take shape, because seeing truth acknowledged publicly carries a weight that private justice never does. The prosecution built its case methodically, layering financial records, testimony, internal correspondence, and psychological patterns, demonstrating not just isolated misconduct but a sustained architecture of coercion. And as witnesses spoke, Alina felt the echo of her mother's presence in the room, not as a ghost, but as validation. Because each account confirmed that Margaret's suffering had not been imagined or exaggerated, it had been strategically induced. Victor's defense leaned heavily on complexity, arguing intent ambiguity, procedural gray areas, and delegated authority, attempting to bury responsibility beneath layers of technicality, but complexity loses its power when pattern becomes undeniable, and the jury listened with an attentiveness that unsettled Victor more than any accusation. Adrian was called as a witness, and his testimony became a turning point, not because he betrayed his father, but because he could not convincingly defend him. His words rehearsed, his tone strained, his pauses revealing fractures he could no longer conceal, and in that moment, Alina saw her brother confront the cost of loyalty, realizing too late that allegiance to power rarely protects those who offer it. Marcus testified as well, quietly, painfully, speaking about family dynamics, control, fear, and the slow erosion of autonomy, and while his account carried emotional weight, it was his restraint that resonated, because truth delivered without theatrics often feels more credible than outrage. Outside the courtroom, public opinion shifted from fascination to reckoning. Conversations expanding beyond Victor to question the systems that enabled him, the boards that looked away, the partners who benefited, and Alina understood that this was the ripple she had hoped for, not vengeance, but awareness that extended beyond a single name. The verdict arrived after days of deliberation, guilty on multiple counts, and while the sentence did not equate to the full scope of harm inflicted, it marked a definitive end to Victor's reign, a formal acknowledgement that his power had been abused, and as he was led away, Alina did not feel triumph, she felt release. The kind that arrives when a weight carried too long is finally set down. In the aftermath, the family faced a different challenge, not crisis, but emptiness, because when a dominant force disappears, those who orbited it must redefine themselves or collapse. Adrian spiraled briefly, retreating into isolation, stripped of purpose and credibility, and Alina resisted the urge to rescue him, knowing that growth demanded discomfort, while Marcus began rebuilding slowly, seeking therapy, distance, and a life unentangled from legacy expectations. The house was sold, its walls holding too many echoes to justify preservation, and Alina watched it empty room by room, each cleared space symbolizing a chapter closed, until nothing remained but architecture divorced from meaning. Financial restitution followed, assets redistributed, charities restructured, and while money could not undo trauma, it enabled repair where repair was possible. Funding programs for legal advocacy, psychological support, and whistleblower protection, initiatives designed to prevent future Margarets from being silenced behind closed doors. Alina declined public recognition, refusing interviews that centered her as heroine, because stories that elevate individuals often obscure systems, and she wanted the focus to remain on accountability rather than myth. Yet privately, she grappled with the cost of her choices, relationships lost, years consumed by vigilance, a sense of identity forged in opposition rather than freedom, and she began therapy herself, confronting the reality that survival strategies, while effective, leave their own scars. One evening, months after the verdict, Alina received a letter from Victor, written in careful handwriting, expressing regret in abstract terms, lamenting misunderstanding, framing himself as a casualty of overreach. And she read it once before placing it in a drawer, not destroyed, not answered. Because closure does not require forgiveness, it requires boundaries. Adrian eventually reached out, tentative, apologetic, admitting confusion, shame, and fear of irrelevance, and their conversation was halting but honest, not reconciliation, but possibility, an acknowledgement that while the past could not be erased, the future remained unwritten. Marcus visited often, their bond strengthened by shared truth, and together they spoke of their mother, not as a victim alone, but as a woman with complexity, resilience, and moments of joy that deserved remembrance beyond her suffering. Years passed, and the empire that once dominated headlines became a case study, its name invoked in business schools as a cautionary tale about unchecked power, ethical erosion, and the illusion of invincibility. And Alina found a quiet satisfaction in that transformation. Because the most enduring revenge is not destruction, it is legacy rewritten. She built a life defined by intention rather than reaction, choosing work that aligned with her values, relationships grounded in mutual respect, and a pace that allowed reflection rather than constant vigilance. Occasionally, she would be asked if she regretted exposing her family, and she would answer honestly, that truth costs, but silence costs more, that love does not require blindness, and that accountability is a form of care, even when it hurts. On the anniversary of Margaret's death, Alina visited the scene near where the old house once stood. The land now developed into public space, and she watched the horizon with a sense of calm, unfamiliar, yet welcome. Because the story that began with silence had ended with voice, not just hers, but many, and in that collective acknowledgement, she found peace, knowing that while she could not change the past, she had altered the future, and that was enough. Time did what justice could not fully accomplish. It settled the noise, softened the sharpest edges of memory, and revealed the true aftermath of power falling. Because the real consequences of Victor's downfall unfolded quietly, in ordinary days that no headlines followed. Victor served his sentence without ceremony, his appeals denied, his influence evaporated, and inside the controlled routine of confinement, he encountered something he had avoided his entire life: irrelevance. Because stripped of authority, he was no longer feared, negotiated with, or obeyed, just managed. And for a man who had defined himself by control, that absence became its own punishment. Adrian attempted reinvention, launching ventures unconnected to the family name, discovering that without inherited dominance, success required humility and collaboration, skills he had never practiced. And while failure followed him initially, it also taught him accountability, something power had shielded him from, and slowly, painfully, he began to understand that identity built on superiority collapses the moment superiority is questioned. Marcus flourished away from legacy shadows, pursuing a career grounded in service rather than status, building relationships where conflict did not equal threat, and his laughter returned gradually, tentative at first, then freer, because healing often arrives as permission to feel safe again. Alina continued her work deliberately, declining leadership roles that mimicked old hierarchies, instead supporting frameworks that distributed authority, mentoring quietly, shaping policy rather than owning spotlight, and in doing so, she discovered a version of strength that did not require constant defense. She visited Victor once, not for reconciliation, but for closure on her own terms, sitting across from him in a sterile room where his posture no longer commanded space. And she spoke calmly, not accusing, not comforting, simply stating that his actions had ended a lineage of silence, that his power would not define their future. And Victor listened, diminished, offering no defense, only the hollow acknowledgement of a man who realized, too late, that control without conscience leaves nothing worth protecting. She left without ceremony, knowing that some conversations do not heal the other person, they heal the one who chooses to end them. Years later, when public memory of the scandal faded into archives and academic discussion, Alina encountered young professionals who referenced the case without recognizing her name, and she preferred it that way, because anonymity felt like freedom rather than erasure. The foundation, once corrupted, was reborn under independent governance, its mission focused on protecting those trapped in coercive structures, and Alina watched from a distance as it succeeded without her, a confirmation that systems built correctly do not depend on singular figures. On quiet evenings, she revisited old journals, not to relive pain, but to track transformation, noticing how early entries were filled with observation and strategy, while later ones spoke of choice, boundaries, and peace, and she understood then that revenge had been a chapter, not the story, a means to reclaim agency, not a destination. She built rituals to honor her mother, not monuments, but living practices: honesty in relationships, refusal to normalize harm, courage to speak early rather than endure silently, and in that, Margaret's presence endured more meaningfully than any statue or nameplate ever could. The siblings gathered occasionally, imperfectly, learning how to relate without hierarchy, without fear, and while scars remained, they no longer defined interaction. Because truth, once acknowledged, creates space for healthier connection, even if forgiveness remains partial. Alina never framed her actions as heroism, because heroes imply villains without context, and reality is more complex. She understood that Victor was shaped by systems he exploited, but exploitation remained a choice, and acknowledging complexity did not excuse harm. The legacy of the Hale family transformed from dominance to warning, from aspiration to lesson, and Alina accepted that some reputations deserve to be dismantled so others can be protected. On a final note, she recognized that revenge achieved through exposure alone risks becoming obsession. But revenge completed through accountability, restructuring, and release becomes transformation. And that distinction mattered, because she had not sought to destroy for pleasure, she had sought to end a cycle. And now, as this story closes, if it held your attention, if it made you think about power, silence, and the cost of looking away, then take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment your thoughts below, because stories like this matter only when they are heard, discussed, and remembered.